Chapter 1. The Unseen Gaze. The cold, unforgiving stone of the great hall floor pressed into Lilah's knees as she scrubbed, her world reduced to the rhythmic scrape of her brush and the acrid scent of lye soap. Around her, the castle hummed with a life she was never truly a part of. Sunlight, fractured into 100 rainbows by the towering stained-glass windows, danced across polished marble and ancient tapestries, illuminating dust motes that swirled like tiny golden spirits. It was a world of breathtaking beauty and crushing power, and Lilah's role in it was simple: to remain invisible. She was good at it. With her plain brown hair pinned tightly in a bun and her gray woolen dress worn thin from countless washings, she was just another shadow in a castle full of them. She kept her head down, her voice low, and her movements efficient, a ghost who polished silver and swept away the ashes of yesterday's fires. Invisibility was survival. But lately, survival felt different. It started as a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a subtle shift in the air that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. At first, she dismissed it as a draft, or a side effect of her own exhaustion. The feeling, however, refused to be ignored. It grew from a fleeting suspicion into a heavy certainty, a tangible weight that followed her through the winding corridors and cavernous chambers of the castle. She was being watched. It was not the casual, dismissive glance of a passing nobleman or the critical eye of the head housekeeper. This was different. It was a gaze that was patient, relentless, and unnervingly focused. It found her whether she was dusting the volumes in the library, tending to the herbs in the garden, or scrubbing floors in the great hall. It was a silent, intense scrutiny that made her feel singled out, exposed, and utterly terrified, because she knew who it was. She didn't need to see him to know. The reaction of everyone else was proof enough. When he entered a room, a hush fell like a heavy blanket. Guards, who stood unflinching for hours, would straighten their spines and stare rigidly ahead. Nobles, full of their own blustering importance, would bow their heads and shrink into themselves. No one dared to meet his eyes. No one except, it seemed, for him. Alpha King Ryker, a name spoken in whispers, a man whose presence was more force than form. He was forged from iron and shadow, a ruler whose formidable reputation was etched into the very stones of his kingdom. He moved with a predator's grace, his silence more commanding than any shout, his stoic expression a mask that betrayed nothing. Lilah risked a glance, a tiny, fleeting peek from beneath her lashes. He stood across the hall, ostensibly listening to an aging duke, but his body was angled slightly, his attention not entirely on the conversation, and his eyes, dark, piercing, and the color of a stormy sea, were fixed directly on her. Not on the duke, not on the hall, but on her, a humble maid on her hands and knees. The air lodged in her throat. It wasn't a look of anger or disdain, the kind she might expect from a king noticing a servant in his way. It was something else entirely. It was focused, possessive. It was the look of a wolf that had singled out its prey, an unnerving, undeniable fixation that held no logical explanation. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She snapped her gaze back to the floor, her cheeks burning with a mixture of fear and humiliation. It had to be a mistake. He was looking at something behind her, or perhaps his gaze had simply landed on her by chance. Kings did not stare at maids, especially not King Ryker, a man who had his choice of every noble daughter and princess from across the continent. To imagine his attention was truly on her was the height of foolish, dangerous arrogance. But as she scrubbed with renewed, desperate vigor, the feeling did not fade. The weight of his stare remained, a scorching brand on her skin. She didn't need to look up again to know he was still watching. This was no accident. This was an obsession, and Lilah, the girl who wanted nothing more than to be invisible, was its unwilling center. Chapter 2. A King's Fixation. The king's solar was a fortress of silence, broken only by the dry scratch of a quill on parchment and the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth. Spread across the massive oak desk were trade agreements, military reports, and petitions from lords of far-flung territories. This was King Ryker's world, a kingdom built on logic, strategy, and the unyielding application of will. His mind was the sharpest weapon in his arsenal, a place of cold calculation where emotion was a liability. But his fortress had been breached. The words on the page blurred, the ink bleeding into meaningless shapes. He saw not the troop movements on the northern border, but the determined set of a jaw, the gentle curve of a neck, and a stray curl of brown hair escaping from a plain white bonnet. Ryker's hand tightened on the quill until the delicate feather snapped between his fingers, the sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary sound of pure frustration. It was madness, utter, consuming madness. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room like a caged wolf. He who could command armies and bring kingdoms to their knees was undone by the sight of a servant, a maid, unseen, unremarkable to anyone else in this entire castle. But to him, she was a blinding light in a world of gray. He didn't even know when it had started, only that it now infected his every waking thought. His council believed his recent unpredictable habits were a sign of immense stress. They whispered about the pressures of the crown weighing on their king. They were fools. The pressure was not the crown, it was her. He had begun to learn her routines, a feat of observation that shamed him with its intensity. He knew she worked the west wing in the mornings, the kitchens in the afternoon, and the great hall before dusk. He knew the path she took through the gardens to fetch water, the way she paused to watch the finches by the fountain when she thought no one was looking. This knowledge was a poison and a balm. Today, he had dismissed his chief advisor mid-sentence, claiming a sudden need to inspect the archives in the East Wing, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. The advisor had bowed, confused but unquestioning. Ryker hadn't gone to the archives. He had taken a narrow, disused servant's passage, his footsteps silent on the cold stone, all for a 2-second glimpse of her polishing the suits of armor that lined the corridor. He had watched, hidden in the shadows as she worked, her movements graceful and efficient. A smudge of soot was on her cheek, and he'd felt an absurd, inexplicable urge to stride forward and wipe it away himself. The impulse was so strong, so primal, that he had to physically grip the stone wall to restrain himself, his knuckles turning white. Now, back in the confines of his solar, the memory of that moment was a fire in his blood. This was not desire as he had known it, a fleeting physical want easily sated and forgotten. This was something deeper, a magnetic pull that defied reason. It was an obsession that felt like a weakness, a crack in his armor that could bring everything to ruin. He was a king. He could not afford a vulnerability, especially one with soft, unassuming eyes and hands raw from scrubbing floors. He strode to the window, looking down upon the sprawling castle grounds. His gaze swept the area, searching, always searching. There. A flash of gray near the stables. It was her, carrying a bucket of water. From this distance, she was just a small, indistinct figure, yet his entire being focused on her as if she were the only person in the world. He tracked her movement until she disappeared from view, leaving an ache of absence in her wake. With a final frustrated sigh, Ryker turned back to his desk. He would force this from his mind. He would drown himself in the duties of his kingdom, in the cold, hard facts of rule. He was the Alpha King. He was in control. But as he picked up a new quill, he knew he was lying to himself. This fixation was not a fleeting thought to be dismissed. It was a chain, and with every glimpse he stole, another link was forged. And he, the most powerful man in the kingdom, was the one who was bound. Chapter 3. The Whispering Court. A court, by its very nature, is a creature of observation. It thrives on glances, murmurs, and the subtle shifts in the currents of power. In King Ryker's court, this was doubly true. With a monarch as stoic and unreadable as their Alpha King, every minute detail of his behavior was dissected for meaning. And lately, the court had a great deal to discuss. He cut the trade envoy from the Southern Reach short this morning, in the middle of a sentence about shipping tariffs, simply stood up and walked out. The Countess fanned herself, her eyes darting toward the throne, where the king now sat, listening to a petition with an air of strained patience. He seems distracted. I saw him yesterday in the West Gardens. No guards, just staring at the rose bushes as if they held state secrets. These were the whispers that had begun to ripple through the castle's gilded halls. The king's formidable predictability was cracking. He would appear in corridors he never frequented. His gaze would drift during council meetings, and his questions in court were often abrupt, as if his mind was only half present. The prevailing theory was that the burdens of the crown were finally showing their weight. But Lady Vivian saw something else. Vivian was a masterpiece of ambition, sculpted from silk, steel, and razor-sharp intellect. With fiery hair that mirrored her spirit and eyes the color of emeralds, she was the most coveted prize in the kingdom, and she had set her sights on the ultimate one, the throne beside Ryker. She did not watch the king for signs of weakness. She watched him for openings, for patterns, and she had found one. From her vantage point near the dais, she wasn't listening to the petitioner drone on about a land dispute. She was watching Ryker. His posture was regal, his expression impassive, but his eyes gave him away. They were not focused on the man speaking. They were fixed on a point in the far corner of the hall, near the servants' entrance. Vivian followed his line of sight. At first, she saw nothing of note. A tapestry, a suit of armor, and a maid, quietly sweeping ashes from a cold hearth. The girl was plain, anonymous, her head bowed in concentration. Vivian's brow furrowed. It couldn't be. But then, the maid dropped her brush. The soft clatter was barely audible, yet the king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He flinched, a minute, controlled reaction that no one else would have noticed. But Vivian noticed everything. It was the missing piece to the puzzle. The king's sudden walk out of the trade meeting. It had occurred just as a servant girl, the same girl, had passed by the chamber doors. His pensive mood in the West Gardens, Vivian now recalled seeing that same maid tending to the flower beds nearby. It wasn't a distraction, it was a destination. A cold, dangerous understanding settled over her. The king's strange behavior wasn't about stress or politics, it was about a person. A nobody. A slow, calculating smile touched Vivian's lips. This wasn't a complication, it was an opportunity. A rival she could understand, a princess, a duchess, was a threat. But a maid was a weakness, a secret shame that could be leveraged. Later that afternoon, she found her moment. While strolling through the courtyard with several other high-born ladies, she saw the maid again, carrying a basket of linens. As if on cue, King Ryker emerged from a nearby archway, his path intersecting with the girl's. For a split second, the king's mask slipped. A flicker of something raw and intense crossed his face as he watched her, a look so potent it made the air crackle. Vivienne paused, placing a delicate hand on the arm of a baron's daughter. "Goodness," she murmured, her voice a perfect blend of innocence and intrigue. "His Majesty takes such a keen interest in the domestic affairs of the castle. One might almost think he was inspecting the quality of the laundry." Her words were light, but their implication was a stone dropped into a still pond. The other ladies followed her gaze, first to the king, then to the bewildered maid, who scurried away, flushed and unaware. The Whispers had just been given a name and a face, and the Whispers were not confined to the nobility. In the steamy heat of the kitchens and the quiet dark of the servants' corridors, the staff had noticed, too.
"He was in the library again," one of the younger maids whispered to the head cook. "Just standing there. Lilah was dusting, and he just watched her. It's not right." The cook, a woman whose face was a roadmap of worry, shook her head, her expression grim. "The lion has noticed a field mouse. You keep your head down, Lilah," she had warned her earlier that day. "Attention like that is a curse, not a blessing. It gets girls like us hurt." Unaware of the storm of speculation she was causing, Lilah only knew that the castle walls felt like they were closing in. The weight of the king's gaze was now compounded by the curious, pitying, and increasingly hostile stares of everyone else. She was no longer invisible. She was a curiosity, a puzzle. And in a place like King Ryker's court, puzzles were meant to be taken apart, piece by painful piece. Chapter 4. A Dangerous Favor. The summons came for Lilah in the laundry, a place of steam, rough linen, and the mundane, comforting scent of soap. She was wringing out a heavy tablecloth when 2 members of the royal guard entered, their polished armor and crimson capes a jarring intrusion into her grayscale world. They did not belong here. Servants scattered, their chatter dying instantly, their eyes wide with fear. Lilah's heart plummeted to the floor. Guards never came for maids unless the charge was a grave one. Theft? Treason? Her mind raced, a frantic catalogue of every rule she might have unknowingly broken. The captain, a man with a face like carved granite, stopped before her. His gaze was impersonal, but his presence was an anvil. "Lilah," he said, and the sound of her own name spoken by him was a shock. "His Majesty, the King, requires your presence in his private study, immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the laundry. The king's study was a place of legend, the sanctum sanctorum, where the kingdom was run, a room more private than his own bedchamber. No servant, save for his most trusted valet, ever crossed its threshold. "Me, sir?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thumping in her ears. "You," the captain confirmed, his expression unreadable. "Bring your sewing kit." The walk to the king's private wing was the longest journey of Lilah's life. With the 2 guards flanking her, she moved through the opulent halls like a prisoner on her way to the gallows. Courtiers and nobles stopped to stare, their faces a mixture of shock and undisguised curiosity. She could feel their whispers on her skin, sharp and stinging. She kept her eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the carpet, her small sewing basket clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The guards stopped before a set of massive iron-bound doors. One of them knocked once, a sharp, definitive rap. A deep voice from within commanded, "Enter." One guard opened the door, gesturing for her to go inside. He did not follow. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound sealing her in, and she was alone with him. The room was a reflection of the man himself. It was vast and imposing, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound tomes. Maps of the kingdom were spread across a long table, held down with daggers. The air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and something else. Something uniquely him. a clean, sharp scent like winter air and steel. King Ryker was not at his desk. He stood by the massive stone fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. He was not dressed in his formal court attire, but in a simple, dark tunic that did little to hide the formidable power in his shoulders and chest. The firelight danced across the hard planes of his face, making his expression seem even more severe. Lilah sank into a deep curtsy, her head bowed so low she could feel the blood rush to her face. "Your Majesty, you sent for me." "I did," he said. His voice was a low rumble, and it seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. "Rise." She obeyed, her hands trembling so badly her sewing basket rattled. She dared to lift her eyes, just for a second, and found his intense gaze already on her. There was a strange tension in him, a tightly coiled energy that was at odds with his relaxed stance. "I am told," he began, moving from the fireplace toward his desk, "that you have a delicate hand with repairs, that you mended the Duchess of Northwood's lace fan so perfectly the tear was invisible." Lilah blinked, stunned that such a trivial piece of servant gossip had reached the king's ears. I do my best, Your Majesty." He rounded the desk and picked up something. It was not a royal scepter or a crown, but a small, worn, leather-bound book, no bigger than his palm. It looked ancient, its cover softened with age, its pages filled with faded, spidery script. A small, intricate silver clasp, shaped like a wolf's head, had broken from its hinge. "This belonged to my mother," he said. His voice clipped, betraying a sliver of emotion he quickly suppressed. "The clasp has come loose. I want it repaired." He held it out to her. It was a test, a command, and a plea all in one. Lilah stepped forward hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his as she took the small book. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. She recoiled as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. The king's own hand flinched back, his jaw tightening as their eyes met. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, dangerous awareness. "Can you do it?" he asked, his voice now rougher, deeper. Lilah stared down at the book in her hands, a fragile, personal piece of his history. This was the pretense. This was the reason he had manufactured to bring her here, to this room, to him. "Yes, Your Majesty, I believe I can," she managed to whisper, her gaze fixed on the broken clasp. "Good," he said, turning away abruptly. He walked back to his desk and sat, pulling a sheet of parchments toward him, as if to work. But he did not read. He simply sat there, a silent, powerful presence at the other end of the room. "You will work here. I wish to see it done." With trembling hands, Lilah found a small footstool near the fire. She sat, opened her sewing basket, and laid out her needles and thread. The only sounds in the room were the crackling of the flames and the frantic beating of her own heart. She bent her head, forcing herself to focus on the delicate task, acutely aware of the king's unblinking gaze on her from across the room. The favor had been given, the trap had been set, and she had walked right into it.
Chapter 5. The Spark of a Storm. Silence, thick and heavy, filled the king's study. It was a silence defined not by absence, but by a powerful, charged presence. Lilah kept her head bowed over her work, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision she did not feel. Every pinprick of the needle, every loop of the fine silver thread was a defense against the suffocating awareness of the man sitting just a few yards away. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight on her shoulders. He was not working. The parchments on his desk remained untouched. The quill in his hand was still. He was simply watching, his stillness that of a wolf before the pounce. The air in the room grew thin, and Lilah found herself taking shallow, careful breaths, terrified that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile piece. Finally, after an eternity, the last thread was knotted, The final stitch secured. The silver wolf's head was once again anchored firmly to the worn leather. It was done. Her reason for being here was over. With a sense of profound relief, Lilah carefully placed the mended book on the small stool beside her. She had to stand, present it to him, and then she could escape. Her leg, tucked beneath her for so long, had fallen completely asleep. As she pushed herself to her feet, 1,000 tiny needles stabbed into her calf, and her balance faltered. A strangled gasp escaped her lips as she pitched forward, her arms flailing. The world tilted violently, the stone hearth rushing up to meet her. She never hit it. A blur of dark motion exploded from the desk. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, crossing the room in 2 silent, predatory strides. An arm like an iron band shot out, wrapping around her waist and hauling her back from the edge of the hearth. Her much smaller body collided with his chest, which felt like a wall of solid muscle. The impact stole the air from her lungs. Her hands flew up, pressing against his tunic for balance, and the world simply stopped. A searing heat blasted through the thin wool of her dress, a current of raw power that seemed to originate from his very core. His scent enveloped her, winter air, steel, and something darker, more primal that was uniquely him. The universe narrowed to the frantic, panicked thud of her own heart and the impossibly steady, powerful beat of his beneath her palm. Time stretched, suspended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. This was no accidental brush of fingers. This was a collision. She was held fast against him, her cheek pressed to the rough fabric of his tunic, his arm an unyielding shackle around her waist. Slowly, hesitantly, she tilted her head back and looked up. The king's impassive mask was gone, shattered. In its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that was more terrifying than any display of fury. His dark eyes, now blazing with an inner fire, stared down at her not with the king's authority, but with the stark hunger of a starving man. It was a look of profound, agonizing conflict, a desperate longing that he seemed to be fighting with every ounce of his legendary self-control. His grip on her waist tightened for a fraction of a second, an involuntary, possessive clinch. He inhaled sharply, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Lilah," he breathed, and the sound of her name spoken in a voice that was rough, strained, and stripped of all its royal command was the most dangerous thing she had ever heard. The spell was broken. Pure, instinctual fear ripped through her. She scrambled back, pushing away from him as if his touch were a flame. His arm fell away, and she stumbled backward until her legs hit the stool, nearly sending her to the floor again. In the sudden, clumsy retreat, the small, repaired book was knocked from its perch. It hit the stone floor with a soft, final thud, a forgotten casualty of the moment that had just passed. They stood frozen, feet apart, the space between them now a chasm crackling with an unspoken, terrifying energy. The king stood perfectly still, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with controlled, powerful breaths. He was a storm, held in check by the sheer force of his will. I am sorry, Your Majesty," Lilah stammered. The words nonsensical. "I stumbled." He didn't answer. His eyes were still locked on her, the raw emotion from moments before now being forced back down behind his kingly facade. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She had to get out. With a clumsy, automatic curtsy, she turned and fled, not daring to look back. She wrenched the heavy door open and ran, leaving the formidable Alpha King alone in his study, the fragile barrier between them shattered into a million pieces. Chapter 6. The Rival's Gambit. Lady Vivienne had seen the maid flee from the king's study. She had watched from a shadowed alcove as the girl, Lilah, had burst from the sacred doors, her face pale with shock, her movements frantic and graceless. It was a sight that confirmed Vivian's darkest suspicions and lit a fire of cold, calculated fury in her heart. The mouse had not only caught the lion's eye, it had been invited into his den. A private audience? The thought was a venomous insult. Vivian, who had spent years cultivating her grace, her wit, and her political acumen to be worthy of the king's notice, would not be undone by a featureless, dust-covered servant. The situation required not just correction, but eradication. Her plan began to form that very evening, a beautiful and cruel tapestry woven from deceit. She knew Ryker. He was a man of honor, but his sense of justice was as sharp and unforgiving as a headsman's axe. An accusation had to be irrefutable, the evidence absolute. The crime had to be so personal, so unforgivable, that even his baffling fixation would be incinerated by the heat of his rage. The next day, citing a desire to commission a new brooch, Vivian requested access to the royal jewel vault, specifically to study the late queen's collection for inspiration. Her station and the plausibility of her request granted her immediate entry. Under the watchful eye of the keeper of the vault, she admired necklaces and earrings, her praise as glittering and hollow as the gems themselves. Then her eyes landed on her target, a heavy gold signet ring engraved with the crest of the she-wolf, the personal sigil of Ryker's mother. It was an item of immense sentimental value, a piece he was known to revere above all others.
With a deft movement, a practiced bit of misdirection involving a dropped handkerchief, the ring was in her palm. It felt cold and heavy, a perfect weapon. The second part of her plan required a pawn. She found one in Margot, another maid who worked in the West Wing, a girl whose ambition was a festering wound behind a perpetual sneer. Vivian cornered her in an empty corridor, her voice a silken whisper of promises. "You find Lilah's work ethic admirable, I'm sure," Vivian began, her smile not reaching her eyes. Margot scoffed. "She's a fool, thinks keeping her head down will earn her something more than a sore back. And yet, it seems to have earned her the king's attention," Vivian said, letting the words hang in the air. She watched with satisfaction as envy and resentment curdled Margot's features. A strange thing. It makes one wonder what else she might feel entitled to. Vivian opened her palm, revealing the queen's signet. The sigil seemed to glow in the dim light. Margot's eyes went wide. "A gift for your troubles," Vivian said smoothly, pressing a heavy purse of gold coins into Margot's other hand. "And a promise. My favor is worth a great deal more than gold, especially when I am queen. All you have to do is ensure this trinket finds its way into Lilah's belongings, her mattress, perhaps. Somewhere it will not be found until it is looked for." Margot's greed warred with her fear, but the battle was short. She snatched the ring and disappeared, a willing serpent in Vivian's garden. That night, as Lilah slept the restless, dream-haunted sleep that had plagued her since the encounter in the study, Margot crept into the Spartan servants' dormitory. With furtive, silent movements, she slipped the heavy gold ring inside the thin straw mattress of Lilah's cot, burying the symbol of royal power amongst the humble possessions of a girl who owned nothing of value. The final act began the following afternoon. Lady Vivian, in a brilliant performance of distress, sought out the captain of the royal guard. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured concern, "forgive me, I may be mistaken, but I was in the vault yesterday, and I feel I must speak. The Queen's signet ring. I cannot shake the feeling that something is amiss. I pray it is safe." The seed of doubt was planted. The keeper of the vault was summoned. A frantic search was conducted. The ring was officially declared missing. Word of the theft spread through the castle like a plague. A royal treasure, a piece of the king's own heart, stolen from under their noses.
The fury that emanated from the throne was a palpable, terrifying force. Ryker ordered a castle-wide search. Every room, every person. Lilah was in the courtyard, shaking out a tapestry when she felt the shift. The whispers that had followed her for days had turned sharp, venomous. She saw guards marching purposefully towards the servants' quarters. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled in her stomach. It didn't take them long. She was still standing in the courtyard when the captain of the guard emerged, his face a mask of grim finality. He walked directly toward her, two of his men flanking him. Behind him, held up for all to see, was Margot, weeping theatrically.
"I saw her," Margot shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Lilah. She was acting strangely near the vault. I knew she was up to no good.
"Lilah?"
The captain's voice was cold iron. "You are accused of the theft of a royal treasure." "What?" The world tilted beneath Lilah's feet. "No, I would never." "We searched your quarters," the captain continued, ignoring her plea. He held up his hand, and in his palm lay the heavy, unmistakable sigil of the she-wolf. The entire court, it seemed, had gathered to watch the spectacle. Lilah looked from the ring to the captain's unforgiving face, to Lady Vivienne, who stood watching with an expression of perfect, sorrowful regret. And in that moment, Lilah understood. This was a trap, a perfectly designed, inescapable cage. The cold, heavy weight of the Queen's signet ring in the captain's palm was the weight of a death sentence. Her world had just come crashing down. Chapter 7. An unlikely champion. The great hall had become a makeshift courtroom, a stage for a verdict that was already written. Lilah stood in the center of the vast cold space, a lone gray figure surrounded by a sea of silks and velvets. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the torches in their sconces, their flames casting long, dancing shadows that twisted like accusers on the stone walls. She was no longer just a maid. She was a spectacle. The damning evidence, the Queen's signet ring, lay on a black velvet cushion on the dais, its golden sigil seeming to mock her with its silent, irrefutable testimony. Lady Vivienne stood near the front, a vision of sorrowful duty, having already given her account of a troubling feeling that led to the discovery of the theft. Margot, the other maid, had delivered a tearful, convincing performance of a loyal servant forced to betray a colleague for the good of the kingdom. The evidence was perfect. The motive, while unspoken, was assumed. A foolish, grasping girl, emboldened by a sliver of royal notice, who had overreached with catastrophic consequences. The captain of the guard finished his report, his voice devoid of emotion. "The ring was found in her mattress, Your Majesty. There is no doubt." Every eye in the hall turned to the throne. King Ryker sat motionless, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He had not said a word throughout the entire proceeding, his stillness a terrifying, coiled power that promised a storm. Lilah, her hands bound loosely before her, did not dare to look at him. She stared at a crack in the floor, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The punishment for theft from the royal family was banishment at best, execution at worst. "And you," the king's voice finally boomed. The sound so deep and resonant, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. It was directed not at Lilah, but at Margot. Margot flinched, then nodded eagerly. "Yes, Your Majesty. She has been different, full of herself. I saw her lurking near the treasury corridor." Ryker's gaze shifted, a slow, deliberate movement until it landed on Lilah. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped in defeat.
She looked small, broken, and utterly alone. A muscle in his jaw clenched, a flicker of something raw and violent in his eyes.
Baron Fitzwilliam, acting as the court's prosecutor, stepped forward. Your Majesty, the evidence is clear. The girl is a common thief. I recommend she be sent to the salt mines of Umber Peak, a fitting punishment for such a grievous betrayal. A murmur of agreement rippled through the court. It was a harsh sentence, effectively a slow death, but the crime was severe. Lilah closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. The salt mines. She would die there, a forgotten thief, her name a curse. No. The word was not a shout. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound of such absolute authority that it shocked the hall into stunned silence. King Ryker rose from his throne. He did not descend the steps. He moved like an avalanche, a force of nature that commanded the space around him. He walked until he stood directly before the Baron, who paled and took an involuntary step back. You find the evidence clear, Baron? You find it plausible that this girl, he gestured toward Lilah without looking at her, a servant who has spent her life in this castle without a single demerit, would suddenly decide to steal the one item I know I hold most dear, an item, I might add, that is utterly worthless to a commoner, as it could never be sold without immediate discovery? The Baron stammered, But, the witness, the ring was in her possession. The witness is a sniveling opportunist whose testimony is worthless, he snapped, his gaze flicking to Margot, who visibly shrank, and the ring was planted in her possession. A collective gasp swept the hall. This was not the dispenser of cold, impartial justice they knew. This was a man, a king, defending a servant with a ferocity that was deeply, shockingly personal. He turned his full attention to Lilah, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fire locked onto hers. For the first time, she looked up at him, and what she saw stole her breath. It was not pity. It was a furious, unwavering belief. "Did you steal this ring?" he demanded, his voice for her alone, a low rumble in the silent hall. "No, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear it." "I know," he said, and the simple, absolute conviction in those two words resonated more powerfully than any royal decree. He turned back to the stunned court, his fury now a palpable, radiating force. He declared, this was a plot, a clumsy, insulting attempt to manipulate your king. I will find who is responsible, and when I do, they will wish they had been sent to the salt mines. He stared directly at Lady Vivienne, his eyes narrowed into slits of cold emerald fire. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, her perfect composure faltering for the first time, a flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it. Ryker ignored her for now. He walked to Lilah and with a swift, decisive movement took the knife from the belt of a nearby guard. Before anyone could react, he sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The soft rasp of the blade was the only sound in the hall. Her hands fell free. He stood before her, not as a king before a subject, but as a shield, a bulwark against the entire world.
"The matter is not concluded," he announced to the court, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But the accused is no longer the accused." He had not just acquitted her, he had declared war on her behalf. The Alpha King,
in a stunning display of personal investment that defied all logic and protocol, had chosen his champion, and it was the most unlikely person in the entire kingdom. Chapter 8. The King's Protection. The Great Hall was a tinderbox of shock and disbelief. The king had not only dismissed the evidence, he had severed Lilah's bonds with his own hand. He stood before her now, a formidable, unassailable wall of royal fury, his declaration hanging in the air like the promise of a coming storm. The accused is no longer the accused. But he was not finished. The silence stretched, thick with tension, as every courtier held their breath, waiting to see what their king would do next. Lilah, her wrists still tingling from the ropes, could only stare at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had placed her at the very center of a tempest she could not possibly navigate. Ryker turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles, his expression cold and hard as glacial ice. He was about to set a fire to centuries of courtly protocol, and he knew it. This plot was an attack not just on a member of my staff, but an attack on the integrity of my throne. It was designed to mislead me, to manipulate my justice. Until the true culprit is unmasked and brought to account, I cannot be certain of the safety of anyone in this castle. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His eyes, dark and unyielding, once again found Lilah. She flinched, feeling as though she were the only person in the room. Therefore, he continued, his voice dropping to a level that was somehow more commanding, to ensure her protection from those who would see her harmed, to conceal their own guilt, and to keep her available for the investigation that will now commence, Lilah will be removed from her current duties. A sigh of relief, faint but audible, rippled through some of the servants gathered at the back. They thought she was being dismissed, sent away from the danger. She is to be placed under my direct and personal supervision, Ryker declared. The sighing stopped. The entire court froze. Baron Fitzwilliam's jaw dropped, and even the captain of the guard looked momentarily stunned. From this moment on, the king's decree echoed off the stone walls. She will serve exclusively within my private chambers. She will take her meals there. She will sleep in the adjoining antechamber. No one is to approach her, speak to her, or give her any command without my explicit permission. She is under my protection. Is that understood? It was not a question. It was a command that bordered on a threat. The scandal of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just shielding her, he was claiming her, bringing a common maid into the most private, hallowed space in the entire kingdom. He was moving a mouse into the lion's den, not as prey, but as a treasured ward.
Lady Vivian's face was a mask of perfect alabaster composure, but a muscle twitched in her cheek, a tiny, furious betrayal of the rage boiling beneath the surface. She had tried to have the girl banished, and instead, the king had brought her closer to him than Vivian herself had ever been. "Your Majesty," the head housekeeper, a woman named Elspeth, stepped forward, her face pale. It was an act of incredible bravery. "Forgive me, but the girl's place, the royal chambers, it is not appropriate." Ryker's head snapped toward her. "Her place," he said, his voice lethally soft, "is where I decree it to be. And it is entirely appropriate that I protect a subject who has been unjustly accused in my name. Would you have me leave her to the vipers who orchestrated this?" Elspeth bowed her head, defeated. "No, Your Majesty." "Good." Ryker turned back to Lilah, his expression softening almost imperceptibly.
The fury he had shown the court was gone, replaced with something quieter, but no less intense. "You will come with me. Now." He turned and strode toward the doors leading to his private wing, not waiting to see if she would follow. He knew she would. She had no choice. With the eyes of every noble, servant, and guard in the castle boring into her back, Lilah took a hesitant step, then another. The whispers started before she had even reached the dais, a rising tide of scandalous speculation. She was his mistress. She had enchanted him. She was a witch. She ignored them, her world narrowing to the formidable back of the king as he carved a path for her through the gawking crowd. He was shielding her, yes, but she understood the terrifying truth of her new reality. This was not a rescue. It was a beautiful, gilded cage, and the king himself had just locked the door, trapping her inside with him alone. Chapter 9. The Gilded Cage. The king's private quarters were a world unto themselves, a sprawling suite of rooms so opulent they made the rest of the castle seem modest. The antechamber, where Lilah was to sleep, was larger than the entire servants' dormitory, furnished with a soft feather bed, silk sheets, and a small fireplace that was kept perpetually lit. Sunlight streamed through a private balcony window, illuminating the intricate patterns of a Myrish carpet. It was beautiful. It was magnificent. And it was the most terrifying place she had ever been. Days bled into a strange, suffocating routine. While the king worked at his massive oak desk, poring over maps and documents, Lilah existed in the periphery. She was given no real duties. She would dust furniture that was already gleaming, straighten books she could not read, and fold linens that were already perfect. She was a decorative object, a living symbol of the king's decree, and the silence between them was a living entity, filled with unspoken questions and simmering tension. She felt his eyes on her constantly. When she polished a silver candlestick, she could feel his gaze tracking the movement of her hands. When she stared out the window at the distant, free world of the castle grounds, she knew he was watching her, his focus and almost physical touch. But the fearsome Alpha King she had known from afar was gone. In his place was a man she did not recognize. The first evening, a lavish tray of food was brought by a servant who refused to meet her eye. Lilah, her stomach a knot of anxiety, couldn't bring herself to eat. Hours later, Ryker rose from his desk, his shadow falling over her where she sat huddled on a small chair by the cold hearth. She flinched, expecting a command, a reprimand. Instead, he knelt. The king of the entire realm knelt before her, holding a small plate with a piece of bread and cheese. "You need to eat, Lilah," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. It was not a command, it was a plea. Stunned into silence, she took the plate, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. This was the man who emerged in the privacy of these chambers, a king haunted by a strange gentleness. He would pace the length of the room for hours, not with purpose, but with a restless, tormented energy, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of pure frustration. He would stop mid-sentence while dictating a letter to his scribe, his gaze lost on her, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He was a storm contained within the walls of a man, and she was the unwilling eye of it. The dam finally broke on the third night. Sleep would not come. Lilah sat by the window in her antechamber, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the moonlit gardens. The door to the king's study creaked open. He stood in the threshold, a dark silhouette against the firelight from his room. He was not wearing his tunic, only his trousers, the powerful lines of his chest and shoulders stark in the dim light. "You are afraid of me," he said. It was not an accusation, but a statement of weary fact. Lilah turned, clutching the blanket tighter. "I am afraid of this, Your Majesty, of being here, of what everyone is saying." He walked slowly into the room, stopping a respectful distance away. "I put you here to keep you safe." "Safe?" she whispered, the word tasting like a lie. "Or a prisoner?" A flicker of pain crossed his face. "Does it feel like a prison?" "It feels," she said, finding a sliver of courage, "like I am waiting for a sentence to be carried out." He closed his eyes for a moment, a look of profound torment settling over him. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice low and strained, "what it was like watching you stand in that hall, accused, helpless, knowing that you were only a target because of me?" The unexpected confession stunned her. "Because of you?" "The vipers in my court are not blind. They saw my interest. Lady Vivian thought to remove the object of my baffling affection." He spat the words like poison. "It was my weakness, my fixation that placed you in that position. My fault." Here it was. The first layer peeled back. He saw his obsession not as a king's right, but as a dangerous flaw that had almost destroyed her. "Why?" she whispered, the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Why me? I am a maid. There is nothing about me to notice."
He gave a harsh, humorless laugh. "Nothing to notice?" He took a step closer, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her heart hammer. "I notice everything. I notice the way you tuck a stray curl behind your ear when you're concentrating. I notice the small humming sound you make when you tend the roses in the West Garden. I notice that you are the only person in this entire kingdom who has never looked at me with fear or ambition, but with an honest, infuriating indifference that has driven me to madness." He stopped, breathing heavily, as if the admission had cost him dearly. He looked vulnerable, stripped bare of his crown and his power, a man wrestling with a force he could not command. "I did not choose it," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, raw with a truth he seemed to be admitting for the first time. "This feeling, this connection, I did not choose it, Lilah. I think from the very first moment, it chose me." Chapter 10. The Unveiling. His last words hung in the moonlit air between them, fragile and terrifying. It chose me. Lilah stared at him, her mind unable to form a coherent thought. The king, the formidable Ryker, was speaking of feelings and fate as if he were a character in a bard's tale, not the ruler of a kingdom built on stone and steel. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What chose you?" He took another step, closing the distance until only an arm's length separated them. The firelight from his study cast half his face in shadow.
but she could see the raw, agonizing honesty in his eyes. The king was gone. Only the man remained. "I think this is about power," he began, his voice low and raw. "You think a king saw something he wanted and decided to take it. That is what anyone would think. It is what I tried to tell myself." He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-reproach. "But it has never been about power. It has been about its complete and utter absence." He looked away, toward the window, as if the memory was too intense to face her while speaking it. "I remember the first time I truly saw you. It was almost a year ago. I was returning from a border dispute in the north. 3 weeks of negotiations and veiled threats. My mind was a knot of strategy and suspicion. The entire court was lined up in the great hall to welcome me back, all of them wanting something, needing something, sizing me up. And then I saw you. You were by the western columns, replacing the candles in a sconce. You were humming a simple, tuneless little song. You were focused entirely on your task, unaware of the procession, of the king, of anything but the flame and your song. And in that moment," he paused, struggling for the words. "In that moment, the entire deafening noise of my life went silent. All the politics, the weight of the crown, the loneliness of my position, it all just vanished. And there was only the sound of your humming." Lilah's breath hitched. She remembered that day. She had been terrified of the king's return, hoping only to finish her task and disappear before he saw her.
Since then, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, it has been a constant battle. My mind, my duty, my honor, everything told me to ignore it, that it was a madness, a dangerous folly. A king cannot afford such a distraction. So I fought it. I tried to stay away, and when I couldn't, I let my reputation serve as my shield. I let the world think my attentions were fleeting, that I was a man who cared for nothing, because it was safer than letting anyone see the truth. He finally turned back to her, his eyes blazing with a desperate, vulnerable light. That I cared only for one thing, one person. He took the final step, his hands rising as if to touch her, then falling back to his sides in a display of fierce restraint. This is not an obsession of a king for a subject, Lilah. I do not know what it is. It is as if my soul, this thing I keep locked away behind walls of iron and duty, recognizes yours. When I am near you, there is a quiet I have not known since I was a boy. It terrifies me, because it is a weakness a king cannot have, and a feeling a man cannot live without. He stood before her, completely exposed. He had just handed her the truth, a weapon that could undo him entirely. The Alpha King, the formidable ruler, had just confessed that his entire world tilted on the axis of a humble maid. He wasn't just admitting to his feelings, he was admitting that for the first time in his life, he was not in control. "I hid it," he whispered, the final confession a weight off his soul. "From my court, from my council. I even tried to hide it from myself, but I cannot any longer. What happened in the Great Hall, the thought of losing you, of you being harmed because of a secret I was too cowardly to face, it broke something inside me." He looked at her, his expression stripped of all pretense, leaving only a man, tormented and hoping. He was giving her all the power, laying his heart, his weakness, and his secret at her feet, waiting to see what she would do with it. Chapter 11. A Flight from Fate. The air in the antechamber crackled, thick with the weight of Ryker's confession. Lilah felt as though the floor had dropped away from beneath her, leaving her suspended in a terrifying, unbelievable void. His words, so full of raw, aching sincerity, were a fantasy she had no right to entertain. They were beautiful poison. She took a step back, the soft carpet a poor anchor in her reeling world. The blanket she was clutching fell to the floor, forgotten. "No," she whispered, the word a small, desperate defense. She shook her head, not in denial of his feelings, but in denial of the reality he was trying to create. "Your Majesty, you cannot mean that. You are tired. The strain of the kingdom—" "Do not," he cut her off, his voice low and pained, "belittle what I have just told you by calling it fatigue. I have never been more clear-headed in my life." His clarity was her chaos. She saw the future he was painting, and it was a masterpiece of ruin. A king and a maid. It was the stuff of tragedies, not fairy tales. She would be a scandal, a weakness his enemies could exploit. He would be seen as a fool, a monarch ruled by a fleeting infatuation.
"This is a madness," she insisted, her voice gaining a frantic edge. "A passing fancy. I am a novelty to you, Your Majesty, a quiet moment in your loud life. But it will pass. Feelings like this, when they are so imbalanced, they always pass." "Imbalanced," he repeated, stepping forward again, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "There is nothing imbalanced about it. You are the only thing that has ever brought balance to my life." His intensity was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing her air. He didn't understand. He lived in a world of power, where his will was law. He could not see the consequences, the impossible gulf that separated their worlds. "And what happens when it is over?" she cried, her terror finally spilling over. "What happens when the novelty fades and you are left with the scandal of your choice? I will be cast aside, a ruined girl with a reputation that will follow me to my grave. And you will be a king weakened by a moment of folly. They will use this against you. Lady Vivienne, your other enemies, they will use me to destroy you." The raw pain in her voice seemed to wound him more than any blade. He looked stricken, as if the thought that she saw herself as his potential ruin was a concept he couldn't fathom. "Is that what you think this is? A game? That I would ever cast you aside? Lilah, I would burn my kingdom to the ground before I let anyone harm you, let alone be the cause of it myself." His promise of protection sounded like a shackle. He was trying to build a cage of love and safety around her, but it was still a cage. She would be his secret, his weakness, forever trapped by the intensity of a feeling she could not return without destroying them both. "You cannot see," she whispered, tears finally blurring her vision. "You are the sun, and I am a moth. If I fly too close, I will be burned to ashes. I cannot be the cause of your ruin. I will not be." Before he could respond, before he could offer another impossible promise, she acted. The instinct for survival, the desperate need to escape a fate that felt both dazzling and deadly, took over. She turned and ran. She didn't grab a cloak, she didn't think about where she was going, she just fled. She wrenched open the door to the antechamber and bolted into the silent, moonlit corridor, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone. "Lilah!" His roar echoed behind her, a sound of pure anguish and command. But for the first time, she did not heed it. She ran faster, down staircases and through shadowed hallways she had spent her life cleaning. She had to get out of his chambers, out of his life, out of the castle. She had to disappear, to become the invisible girl she once was, before this beautiful, terrible fate had chosen her. She was not rejecting a king. She was fleeing from a fire that threatened to consume everything she had ever known. Chapter 12. A Kingdom in Turmoil. Lilah's flight was a spark thrown into a powder keg. By dawn, the castle was a hive of frantic, whispered activity. It began with the servants, the maids who found her antechamber empty, the guards who saw a fleeting shadow disappear through a postern gate in the dead of night. The news spread from the scullery to the stables, then up through the ranks to the squires, the ladies-in-waiting, and finally to the high lords of the court. The story twisted and mutated with every telling. The maid had been cast out. She had been a spy who had escaped. The king, driven to madness, had killed her. But the most scandalous and persistent rumor was the truth. She had fled from the king himself. The court, which had been merely suspicious, was now in open chaos. The king's bizarre fixation was no longer a private eccentricity. It was a matter of state security and royal stability. A monarch who could be so thoroughly undone by a common servant was a monarch whose judgment could not be trusted. In his study, Ryker was a caged storm. The news that Lilah had successfully evaded the castle patrols and disappeared into the countryside had settled in his gut like a shard of ice. He had dispatched his most trusted trackers, not with the fanfare of a royal manhunt, but with quiet, desperate orders. Find her, keep her safe, bring her home. His council, sensing the shift in the political winds, chose this moment to strike. They did not request an audience, they demanded one. Led by the calculating Lord Danvers and the pompous Baron Fitzwilliam, a delegation of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom entered his study, their faces masks of grave concern that did little to hide their opportunism. "Your Majesty," Lord Danvers began, foregoing the usual pleasantries, "the court is in turmoil. The kingdom is unsettled. This situation with the maid has become untenable." Ryker, who was standing by the window, staring out at the road leading away from the castle, did not turn. "The situation," he said, his voice a low growl, "is that a young woman who was the victim of a malicious plot has been frightened away by the vipers in this court." "Be that as it may," Baron Fitzwilliam interjected, puffing out his chest, "the perception is what matters. The perception is of a king who has allowed an infatuation to compromise his judgment. It makes the crown look weak." Weak. Ryker finally turned, his eyes blazing with a cold fury that made both men flinch. "I have never been stronger." "Your strength is not the issue, Your Majesty," Danvers said, his tone placating, but his words sharp. "It is the stability of your rule. The lords from the northern reach are already restless. They see this as a sign of chaos at the capital. They question your focus." He paused, letting the threat land. "An alliance with the House of Valois has been proposed. A marriage to the Princess Isabel would solidify our northern border and silence these whispers of instability once and for all." Here it was, the true cost of his love laid bare on the political battlefield. They were pressuring him to trade his heart for a treaty. "They are asking you to choose the kingdom over a dalliance," Fitzwilliam added bluntly. The word dalliance struck Ryker with the force of a physical blow. He stalked from the window until he was towering over them, his sheer presence a suffocating force. "You speak of her as if she's a blight to be excised," he snarled. "A piece on a game board to be sacrificed. You have no concept of what you are asking. We are asking you to be a king. Publicly renounce this girl. Banish her, if you must, to prove the rumors are false. Then accept the Valois betrothal. It is the only logical path, the only path that ensures peace." Ryker stared at them, the furious heat in his chest cooling into something harder, more resolute. He finally understood. They were not just trying to control his crown, they were trying to control his soul. They were asking him to destroy the one true thing in his life for the sake of political convenience. He saw the future they offered, a loveless marriage, a life of cold duty, and the eternal gnawing emptiness of having betrayed not just Lilah, but himself. The cost of their peace was his own damnation. "There is more honor and loyalty in that girl's little finger than in this entire council," Ryker said, his voice dropping to a lethally quiet register. "She is not a dalliance, she is not a political pawn, and she is not a sacrifice I am willing to make." He walked back to his desk and sat, the gesture a clear dismissal. "Find another way to placate the northern lords. My heart is not a territory to be bartered for peace. This matter is not open for debate. Now get out." The lords stood, stunned into silence by his absolute, unwavering defiance. They bowed stiffly and retreated, leaving the king alone in the quiet of his study. The battle was over, but Ryker knew the war had just begun. He felt the immense weight of his choice press down on him. The fate of his kingdom on one side, and the love of a terrified, fleeing maid on the other. He had made his stand. He would not lose her, not to their politics, and not to her fear. Chapter 13. The Defiance of a King. The emergency summons was a royal command that could not be ignored. Within the hour, the throne room was filled to capacity with every high lord, council member, and influential noble within the castle walls. They stood in hushed, expectant clusters, their fine robes a tapestry of muted colors against the cold gray stone. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and political ambition. The consensus was clear. The king, having seen the folly of his ways, had called them here to announce his betrothal to a suitable princess. He had been forced to choose his kingdom. They had won. Lady Vivienne stood near the front, a vision of regal confidence, her expression one of serene anticipation. Lord Danvers and Baron Fitzwilliam exchanged a look of quiet triumph. The pressure had worked. The king would bend. The heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open, and all conversation ceased. King Ryker entered, not as the tormented man who had confessed his soul in the dark, but as the formidable Alpha King they all knew and feared. He was clad in his formal black and silver tunic, a simple iron circlet on his brow, the only sign of his station. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He ascended the dais and settled onto the throne, his gaze sweeping over them all, cold and imperious. "You were summoned," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that needed no amplification to reach the furthest corners of the hall. "Because there are matters of state that require absolute clarity." He let his eyes rest on Lord Danvers. "My council has been most diligent in presenting me with proposals for political alliances. They speak of solidifying borders, of ensuring stability, of silencing whispers of unrest. They speak of marriage." The nobles shifted, a collective leaning in. This was it. "I have been presented with offers from the House of Valois, from the Southern Reach, from the Isles," Ryker continued, his tone flat and emotionless, listing the potential matches as if they were livestock at market. "Each of these unions, I am assured, would benefit the kingdom. Each would be a strategic and logical step for a king to take." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the arms of his throne, and the steel entered his voice. "I will not be taking any of them." A wave of shock rippled through the assembly. Lord Danvers' face tightened, his triumph evaporating. "These proposals are dismissed," Ryker declared, his voice ringing with the finality of a gavel strike. "All of them, now and forever. Let me be perfectly clear, so that no one in this room or this kingdom misunderstands me again." He rose to his feet, a towering, indomitable figure of royal authority. "My hand in marriage is not a bargaining chip. My heart is not a negotiating tool to be traded for a few leagues of land or a temporary peace. The vow I make will be one of honor and truth, not political convenience. My life's loyalty will not be sold to the highest bidder." He thundered through the hall, a stunning rebuke of the very foundation upon which their world was built. He was rejecting centuries of tradition, of strategic royal marriages, for a principle they could not comprehend. "The stability of this kingdom is my responsibility, and I will secure it with my strength, my strategy, and, if need be, my blood, not with the sacrifice of my soul on a marriage bed." He stopped, his gaze sweeping over them, daring any man to challenge him. The hall was utterly silent, the nobles frozen in a state of collective disbelief. "You urge me to choose a suitable match, one who was worthy of being a queen." His eyes found Vivian in the crowd, and for a moment a cruel, mocking light entered his expression before it vanished. "I have already found one." The words landed like a physical blow. 100 minds raced, trying to place this mysterious noblewoman he had chosen in secret. "I have found a woman whose integrity is more valuable than any dowry, whose heart is more true than any royal bloodline, whose spirit is stronger than any fortress wall. She is the one I have chosen. She is the only one I will ever choose."
He looked out over their stunned faces, a king utterly alone in his conviction, yet more powerful than they had ever seen him. "This council is dismissed," he commanded, his voice once again the cold crack of a whip. And with that he turned and strode from the throne room, leaving a maelstrom of chaos and outrage in his wake. He had made his grand public gesture. He had declared his unwavering intention to a court that saw it as madness, a promise of honor to a woman who was not even there to hear it. He had, in essence, just gone to war for a queen who had already fled the battlefield. Chapter 14. The Final Choice. The village was a small, forgettable speck on the kingdom's map, a place of muddy roads and simple folk, where a lone woman could easily disappear. Lilah had found a room in a dusty, timber-framed inn, paying for it with the few coins she had managed to save over the years. Her entire world was now contained in a small, lumpy bundle on the bed. She was tying the last knot on her meager belongings, her hands shaking, when a soft, hesitant knock came at the door. It wasn't the innkeeper. It wasn't a village guard. It was a knock she felt in her very soul. Her heart stopped, then began to pound a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She stood frozen, praying she was wrong. The knock came again, gentle but firm. With trembling fingers, she unlatched the door and opened it just a crack. And her world tilted on its axis. It was him. King Ryker stood in the dim, narrow hallway of the common inn, looking utterly and impossibly out of place. He was not flanked by guards. He wore no circlet, no sigils of his office. He was dressed in the simple, unmarked leather and wool of a common traveler, his dark hair disheveled from the road, his face etched with exhaustion and a desperate, aching hope.
He looked for the first time like a man. Lilah's first instinct was to slam the door, to run, to bolt. "Lilah," he said, his voice quiet and rough with travel, "I am not here to command you." She opened the door fully, too stunned to do anything else. He didn't move to enter, respecting the threshold of her small, temporary world. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not safe for you. I am a danger to you." "The only danger to me," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a raw sincerity that stripped her of all her defenses, "is a life without you in it." He saw the bundle on the bed, the finality of her preparations. A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he didn't falter. "I know you are afraid," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "I know that what I am asking seems impossible. I know the world sees a king and a maid, but when I look at you, I do not see a servant. I see the other half of my own soul. I told them, Lilah. I stood before my entire court and told them. I dismissed the alliances. I rejected the princesses. I told them my heart was not a prize to be bartered, and that I had already chosen." He took a single, hesitant step into the room, his presence filling the small space, not with power, but with a profound, vulnerable energy.
"But their opinions do not matter, and my choice does not matter," he said, the admission a breathtaking concession. "Only yours does." He stopped before her, close enough to touch, but making no move to do so. He was giving her all the space, all the power. "I have come here to offer you a genuine choice," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not an ultimatum, a choice. And I swear on my mother's name I will honor whatever you decide." He took a deep breath, laying his heart bare. "The first choice is this. You come back with me, not as my ward, not as my secret, not as my servant. You come back to stand beside me, as my equal. We will face the court, the kingdom, and all its vipers together. We will build a life, and I will spend every day proving that you are not a weakness, but the greatest strength I have ever known. I don't want a subject, Lilah. I want a partner, my queen." The word hung in the air, both a promise and a plea. "Or," he continued, his voice dropping, laced with the agony of the possibility, "there's the second choice. You tell me to leave, and if you do, I will walk out that door, and you will never see my face again. Your freedom is more important than my happiness." Tears began to stream silently down Lilah's cheeks. This was the one thing she had never expected, the freedom to say no. "But you will not be left with nothing," he swore, his voice thick with emotion. "I will see you are protected. You will be given gold, a new identity, and safe passage to any land you desire. You can build a new life, a life of peace, far from the troubles of my court. No one will ever know who you were. You will be safe, and you will be free. I will ensure it." He had laid his power and his heart at her feet. He was offering her a crown worn as equals, or a quiet life guaranteed by his love, a future with him or a future without him, but both built on a foundation of his respect for her. He stood before her, the king of a nation, looking at her as if she held the fate of his entire world in her hands, because she did. "The choice is yours, Lilah," he whispered, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Truly, tell me what you want." Chapter 15. The Rise of a Queen. Tears streamed down Lilah's face, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of a dam breaking, of a lifetime of quiet resignation washing away to reveal something she had kept buried deep in her heart, a fierce, terrifying, and undeniable love. She looked at this man, her king, who was offering her not a cage,
but a choice. He was offering her a crown or her freedom, both with the same reverence, the same unwavering respect. In his eyes, she saw no king demanding a subject, but a man bearing his soul, willing to risk his own happiness for hers. And in that moment, all her fear seemed like a distant echo. Her hand, which had trembled with terror in his presence days ago, rose with a steady, newfound purpose. She did not curtsy, she did not bow. She reached up and gently touched his face, her thumb brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. He flinched at the contact, not in surprise, but as if her touch was a spark of life he had long been denied. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand with a sigh that was a mix of relief and surrender.
"You were wrong about one thing," she whispered, her voice clear and strong despite the tears. His eyes opened, full of pained uncertainty. "What's that?" "You said my choice was between becoming your queen or walking away," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "But I have never been free. I have been a prisoner of my station, a prisoner of my fear. The only real freedom you are offering is the freedom to stand by your side." A slow, breathtaking dawn of hope broke across his face. "I choose you, Ryker," she said, speaking his name as an equal for the first time. "I choose to fight the vipers with you. I choose to face the world with you. I am not a moth, and you are not the sun. We are the same storm, and I am no longer afraid to let it break." The joy that erupted in his eyes was more brilliant than any crown. He didn't speak. Instead, he mirrored her gesture, his large, calloused hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound, silent communion. The king and the maid were gone. In that small, dusty room, there were only two souls who had finally found their way home. Their return to the castle was not a secret. They rode through the main gates on a single black warhorse, Lilah seated before Ryker, his arm a secure and protective band around her waist. She did not hide her face. She held her head high, meeting the stunned, disbelieving stares of the guards and servants with a calm she had never known. Without a word, Ryker led her directly to the throne room, where the court was still reeling from his earlier declaration. As they entered, a wave of gasps and furious whispers swept the hall. He strode to the center of the room, Lilah's hand held firmly in his, and turned to face them. Lady Vivian's face was a mask of pure, venomous hatred. Lord Danvers looked as if he had been slapped. "I told you I had already chosen," Ryker's voice boomed, silencing the room. "You assumed I spoke of a hidden princess or a noble lady. You assumed wrong. You looked for worth in titles and dowries, and in your blindness, you missed the treasure that was right here among you." He turned to Lilah, his gaze softening with a love so potent it was a physical force in the room. "You see a maid. I see more strength, more honor, and more courage than resides in any royal house in this land. I see a heart that is worthy of an empire. I see my queen." He then did something no one expected. He knelt. On one knee, before the entire assembly, King Ryker bowed his head to a servant girl. "Lilah," he said, his voice thick with emotion for all to hear, "will you do me the honor of being my wife, my partner, my queen?" Lilah looked down at the king kneeling at her feet and out at the sea of shocked and hostile faces. Her fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective love. She was not just accepting him, she was choosing him and his kingdom, with all its dangers. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a silver bell. "I will." Ryker arose, a brilliant, unguarded smile transforming his face. He looked years younger, a man unburdened, and in front of his stunned court, his furious council, and a world that would call him a fool,
He lowered his head and kissed her.
It was not a chaste political kiss. It was a kiss of profound truth, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It was the sealing of a vow, a public declaration more powerful than any decree. In that moment, the whispers died, replaced by a stunned, absolute silence. He was not asking for their permission. He was showing them the new reality of their world. He was showing them the rise of their queen. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey with Ryker and Lilah. Their story has been a pleasure to tell, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Now I'd love to hear from you. What do you think happens next for the new queen and her king? What challenges do you think they will face from Lady Vivienne and the rest of the court? And most importantly, what was your favorite moment in the story? Let me know everything in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to support more tales like it, please take a moment to like this video and share it with a friend who loves a good romance. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new adventure. Your support means the world to me and allows me to keep creating these stories for you. Thank you again for listening, and I can't wait to see you in the next story.